on this finally rainy day on the background, we have to talk about perhaps a question, perhaps a surprise of a question, which is Assassination Rogue at the moment one of the best ones of the specs for Mythic Plus in the next expansion? Now, this would be a surprising question for two reasons. Reason number one, because throughout the beta and throughout these early working sims, some of the questions and some of the attention went to some of the better performing specs like Arcane Mage, for example, Frost or Unholy DK at some point. At another point it was Marksmanship or BM Hunter, and of course the Shaman specs or even the Warlock specs after the mega buffs of a couple of weeks ago. But Assassination, not really. Not many people really cared about Assassination, and yet right now we have the question on whether or not they are the best spec. The other point is a historical one, right? Because historically, if you go down the expansions and try to read the name Assassination down the list of popular specs, you practically have to go back all the way to like 6-something years ago to find Assassination in the first season of BFA. That's the last time they had any major presence in Mythic Plus keys. So Assassination is not exactly one of the to-go melee specs you think about when talking about Mythic Plus. So what exactly happened for them to become this powerful, or seemingly this powerful? When looking at the results in Mythic Plus keys, Assassination now being able to contend or beat, or at the very least match or be close with other considered very powerful specs at the moment in Mythic Plus. Point number one is, of course, you kind of have to be helped by Blizzard, right? You have to be buffed by Blizzard. So Blizzard started almost a couple of months ago, starting to power up the quite buggy and quite weak hero talents of Rogue, including Deathstalker. They then continued to buff Deathstalker multiple times. Once they were done with buffing the hero talents, they went straight to buffing the actual specs, you know. By the end of July, in a back-to-back series of buffs, Assassination's all damage was buffed by 14%. Their auto-attack damage was buffed by 20% in total. Their AoE finisher, Crimson Tempest, was buffed by 8%. They got more energy back based on their bleeds, as well as their single-target finisher buffed by 10%, and another 10% buff to their AoE finisher. So that definitely helps. However, they also got some positive mechanical changes. Assassination at the moment has one of the more overstated bottom parts of hero talent trees in relation to how much damage they can give the spec. Usually, if a single talent point can give you 5-ish% more damage, it's considered a good talent point. Take, for example, Sudden Demise though. Sudden Demise, in its current state, in the effect it has almost 5% damage in a Mythic Plus key by itself. And that's without even including the actual 10% bleed damage it gives you. And once you actually bunch up together all of your bleed damage, this 10% is going to equal to roughly 5% more damage as well. So you have a single talent point giving you some 10% extra damage, which would be already considered very, very powerful. But talking about what can give you 10+% more damage in a single talent point being very powerful, guess what gives you even more? Well, it's Caustic Spatter. Caustic Spatter is the Assassination's version of Flurry for Outlaw Rogue, or the Crash Lightning of an Enhancement Shaman. You tag one mob with Mutilate and then for 10 seconds you splash nature damage to all enemies around this tagged mob. And this one simple talent is having a massive amount of effectiveness in terms of the damage it can give you. But that's not all. The Indiscriminate Carnage reworked from the initial version of Dragonflight being a 90-second cooldown and then buffed to being a 1-minute cooldown, and now no cooldown whatsoever. It's just a passive of you coming from stealth. This is extremely powerful because now your massive spreading of dots is no longer tied by having to wait for a cooldown. You know, if you look for this opener, not even in the first 56 seconds, just in the first pull practically of the entire dungeon, you will see that the casts of this rogue will be able to open up his first pull with a very simple Garrote, Rapture, Garrote, Rapture. And now you suddenly have, thanks to Indiscriminate Carnage, 6 Garrotes out and 6 Raptures out. on 6 different targets. That's a total of 12 different bleeds, which will give you 96 energy every time they tick for damage in total. This amount of energy allows you for way more casts of Mutilate or more likely Fan of Knives, to use way more Envenoms, to splash way more nature damage, for Caustic Spatter to do its AoE thing. You also have one of the biggest steroids in the game in terms of a single talent, which is Scent of Blood. Each enemy afflicted by your Rapture increases your agility by 4% and it caps at 5 targets. Well, we just said that with just these 2 casts, these 2 GCDs, you are tagging 6 enemies with Rapture, which means that from the very first few seconds of a pool, you are able to get 20% more agility, practically permanently, as long as you have 5 or more enemies tagged with Rapture. 20% agility buff is practically an active trinket in terms of main stat. It's a very powerful buff to have. And all of this together was already giving you a very powerful flow in Mythic Plus for your damage, opening up a pool to be able to have immediately quite a good amount of Garrotes and Raptures out for your bleed damage to start rolling, as well as your energy regen to start to become very high. Crimson Tempest being buffed multiple times, now over 20% buffs in the past few weeks, now being extremely effective. A single cast giving you 7 million damage for a finisher is massive. And then with all of this energy you keep gaining, you just go for Fan of Knives into Envenom, Fan of Knives into Envenom, Fan of Knives into Envenom, and you keep splashing AoE damage thanks to Caustic Spatter. Now, what is making this even stronger in the War Within is Deathstalker. Now, at first glance, when you look at Deathstalker and you're wondering what is making it good, you're looking at the damage of this rogue, easily topping the meters, right? So it's doing very well. And then you look at this damage and you're like, well, this is terrible. You know, this Deathstalker's mark is doing no damage. You know, I'm used to nowadays seeing the power of some of these hero powers, like the Tempest of Enhancement, being almost 20% damage in terms of hero talent power. That's practically all we have seen from hero powers right now. You know, here's a Frost DK getting 26% of their damage from their hero talents. So when I'm looking at a rogue doing less than like 3% with its main hero talent power, that seems very poor, which is true. The current explosion you gain every time you consume one of these marks is terrible. The power of this mark comes from applying Deathstalker's mark with Ambush on an enemy and then consuming each and every one of these 3 marks with your finishers. Once you have consumed 3 of these marks, you gain what you want, which is Darkest Night. This is what guarantees a crit on your next Envenom and makes it 60% stronger, on top of giving you 40 energy. And this huge Envenom is also what is going to reapply Deathstalker's mark to a new target, unless the previous target with your mark died with its mark still on, in which case you will gain this one for free. And this combination works quite well for an Assassination Rogue in its pools because of how quickly you can cycle amongst these buffs, because after your initial opener, being able to use, for example, Fan of Knives into Finisher, into Fan of Knives, into Finisher, go back in Stealth to spread another Garrote, and then Finisher, Fan of Knives, Finisher, Fan of Knives, Finisher. The amount of spenders you are using, and in particular one spender, your Envenom spender, is making your AoE very competitive at the moment. And this is not with some major cooldowns. That's the thing. Assassination relies mostly on Distalty plus Kingsbane plus Deathmark, and they are not particularly strong. The damage of your Deathmark is quite low because it's a single target damage tool. It doesn't really do that much AoE damage. It practically doesn't do AoE damage. It just duplicates your bleeds on one target. But those are bleeds, and bleeds don't do nature damage and they don't spread with Caustic Spatter. Pistol T, sure, gives you 100 energy and mastery over 6 seconds, but you're gaining so much more energy in Mythic Plus thanks to Venomous Wounds that Pistol T is not nearly as powerful. The only one that does have more value in Mythic Plus and in AoE is Kingsbane, because it is nature damage, meaning it spreads with Caustic Spatter for AoE. but these are nowhere near the level of value of certain other specs AoE power when it comes to cooldowns. So your damage, the power of your damage mostly comes from your straightforward talent synergy, rather than being reliant on some mega timings to line up together with the cooldown of your tanks every couple of minutes to pull 5 packs and pop all your CDs. Your damage can be way more consistent, which might turn out to be a weakness, because we have already seen metas in Mythic Plus where you do indeed base the power of the comp on how powerful they can be every couple of minutes when they can line up all of their cooldowns. So perhaps not having nearly as powerful AoE cooldowns in this 2 to 3 minute window might come to hurt Assassination. But one of their other powers is their lack of terrible target capping. This is something that, for example, one of its nearby specs, Outlaw, is much more affected by, which is not being able to do damage beyond multiple targets. The good thing about Caustic Spatter is that it doesn't have a hard cap. It only has damage reduction beyond 5 targets, but it still does damage beyond 5 targets. Same goes for your bleeds. Your bleeds of Indiscriminate Carnage, nothing stops you, for example, in your first pull to be able to pull 10 enemies and you being able to use Garrote Rapture, Garrote Rapture, Garrote Rapture, and applying them 9 times to 9 different enemies. You're not getting any diminishing returns, any reduced damage, because you just dotted up 9 targets. You're also not getting any less energy if you are dotting up 9 targets with Venomous Wounds, for example. Same goes for the AoE bleed you can apply with Crimson Tempest. If you have 30 targets, you can apply Crimson Tempest bleed on 30 targets. So you're not nearly as negatively impacted by target caps as a few other specs. And then of course, being a rogue, you still have your other utility as well as your other tankiness that you get by being a rogue, which is what is currently giving you this damage that has gotten so many players being quite optimistic about the current state of the damage profile of an Assassination Rogue in Mythic Plus. After all of the buffs they have received, the value now of Envenom again in Mythic Plus, even in AoE, has skyrocketed. Now you're practically only using Crimson Tempest basically once per pull, because it's not target capped and it's applying some like 18-second long bleed at full combo points. So once this is down, you can just focus on spamming your Envenom, because that's now what you're gonna do for AoE damage, since it's gonna be splashing AoE damage with Caustic Spatter. You have some min-maxing you can do, perhaps unintended min-maxing with Sanguine Blades, since the idea of this talent is to pull energy to stay at high energy or don't drop below 50%, so your bleeds do more damage. The problem is you now are in this bizarro situation where you do more damage with your direct ability, which is Envenom, than you do with your bleeds. So you don't want to pull your energy and stay above a certain threshold to drain more energy to make your bleeds do more damage. You instead want to do the opposite. You want to dump that energy because you want to cast your Envenoms because of the damage that now you get to do with Envenom and with Caustic Spatter. The only possible danger at the moment for Assassination, given this type of damage profile being very good in Mythic Plus, is, and we're going to be talking about this perhaps in a few days, about the possibility of the, again, repetition of what we have already seen for a while, which is a very similar meta than what we have already seen, which is Vengeance being the main tank, being it promotes magic damage, being it promotes mage, that gives you Arcane Intellect, that promotes even more magic damage, that can then facilitate something like Augmentation Evoker, which can facilitate another caster, perhaps Elemental Shaman, perhaps a Warlock spec, and you go back to having what we have gotten for the past couple of seasons of this, this trio of an Augmentation Evoker and 2 casters, which would hurt the chances of Assassination becoming a more staple pick in Mythic Plus or making it into some kind of melee comp in Mythic Plus. But at the moment, on its own merit, on its own value, given the results we have seen in the beta recently when it comes to Assassination, it has been the overall better performer in Mythic Plus. Definitely when it comes to, at the very least, melee specs in Mythic Plus. So this is, of course, for now, still a very early preliminary thought on the state of the spec getting into Mythic Plus. Many things might change based on balance tuning, just like Just like Assassination and the other rogues, to be fair, have been buffed week by week for the past few weeks, same could happen to other specs, or reverts, nerfs to some of these buffs that were given to Assassination might happen and weaken their current power. But for now, this is where we are at when it comes to the current value in the beta for Assassination Rogue, specifically for Mythic Plus. So, for today, with this recap done on this Wednesday, it is now time to leave each other once more. Thanks, of course, as usual, for having watched the video and also for having supported completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching, see you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I like it when it finally rains, and with all the humidity coming, it just ends up being even hotter than it was before.